Hello, I'm David Breen. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom summertime style when we are live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 a.m. Central Time. This week and next week, I'm looking at my happy place, and that is a consideration of how nature begins to be part of the Unitarian and Universalist ideas for a good thing. So we can go walking with Thoreau. Just yesterday on Minnesota Public Radio, Angela Davis had a segment called Nature as a Healer. There it is, someone out walking in the woods to get the soul benefit. We wouldn't be talking about that, and it wouldn't be on the radio if there hadn't been a transcendentalist movement that really began to change the idea of what nature looked like and was considered here in the United States after the Romantic movement in Europe. Well, we do need to think back a little bit in time to kind of catch on to what was going on when transcendentalism occurred. We need to look back at William Ellery Channing, who is by many, most people considered to be the founder of Unitarianism within the United States tradition. And he did that in a discourse called Unitarian Christianity, a discourse on some of the distinguishing opinions of Unitarians, and this was part of an address in Baltimore in 1819. Now, this was a coming out of the Unitarians. They had been called Unitarians as a dismissive way of referring to them. And finally, he's going to come out and say, this is what Unitarians actually believe. Now, Channing lived from 1780 to 1842. He specifically rejected the deism of his day. When he was at Harvard College, most of the young men who were going to school there were deists, but he insisted that Christianity was the way to go, and he later insisted upon that as he declared the Unitarianism as separate from the Trinitarianism of his day. So he's very specifically setting up Christianity as the way that Unitarians will deal with religion. They're not going to go off into this deism that was so popular during the American Revolutionary War period. Well, a generation later, a young minister comes along by the name of Theodore Parker. And he says, I felt early that the liberal ministers did not do justice to simple religious feeling. All their preaching seemed to relate too much to outward things, not enough to the inward pious life. Most powerfully preaching to the understanding, the conscience, and the will, the cry was ever duty, duty, work, work. They failed to address with equal power the soul and did not also shout joy, joy, delight, delight. So this is his critique of the Unitarianism that had developed out of what William Ellery Channing was talking about back in 1819. Now, he was at the Divinity School address that was given by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1838. Ralph Waldo Emerson was asked to address the graduating ministers at the Divinity School at Harvard, and he gave the Divinity School address. After giving it, he was not invited back to Harvard for many, many years. This is what he had to say. I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say I would go to church no more. Men go, thought I, where they are wont to go, else had no soul entered the temple in the afternoon. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him and then out of the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of the snow. He smiles and suffers, yet was there not a surmise, a hint in all the discourse that he had ever lived at all? That was Emerson's great critique, bringing that transcendentalism to the Harvard grads And Theodore Parker was one of those listening, and he signed on the dotted line right at that moment to become a transcendentalist in the way that he was seeing things. And that is to get the human life, the joy, into the way that Unitarians were looking at the world. To make it really clear, Emerson did say this: I like the silent church before the service begins better than any preaching. Yes, you can get involved in the nature, the atmosphere, and that's what's important, not all of those words that are about duty. And so you see how the transcendentalists are looking at these things. So, a good short definition of transcendentalism is the spiritual unity of all forms of being, God, people, and nature, all sharing a universal soul, the oversoul. Now, wait a minute, how do we get to that point? As I mentioned on Tuesday, Immanuel Kant was the first philosopher in the Western tradition to talk about how human knowledge transcends sensory experience. We do indeed have all of these sensory experiences all the time, but there is something added into that that transcends the merely physical. And that is where the art and the religion and the philosophy come from. Now, that idea goes into European style romanticism, as I mentioned on Tuesday, and probably best spoken of by William Wordsworth in a famous poem called The Tables Turned from 1798. Sweet is the lore which nature brings, our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things we murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves, meaning pages, come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. Calling all those scholars out into the world, let's go experience nature firsthand and have those beautiful ideas that transcend mere materiality. If you can see the picture, William Wordsworth, as he is being pictured on the particular book cover that I chose, is wearing a Napoleon haircut. We forget about people in the day kind of following style and fashion trends, but yes, the young Wordsworth was very much a Republican, a believer in the French Revolution and the overthrow of monarchy. And that was very much a part of the Romantic Age, as we know from people like Beethoven. So that's the movement in Europe. And a little bit later, it comes to the United States in the form of transcendentalism. The great shot over the bow by transcendentalism was by Ralph Waldo Emerson when he published an essay called Nature, a book-length essay in 1836. And the transcendentalists are going to be leaning toward pantheism. Why? Well, let's look at nature. And nature is enough. And when we began to talk that way, we began to get into this more pantheist idea. Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Oversoul from 1841, a little bit later than Nature, is the best articulation of what the real idea of a deity is, the theist idea that goes into transcendentalism. It comes from the Vedic concept of Paramatman, Param meaning supreme and Atman meaning soul. The Vedas are ancient, about 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and they are oral that were later written down. And they talk about all of nature and the universe being one thing, that is the supreme soul. And that's probably where Ralph Waldo Emerson got his idea of the oversoul. I have mentioned this book before, but American Veda is a great book by Philip Goldberg that talks about how the ideas of Hinduism come into the U.S. and really permeate all kinds of philosophy and theology that we have in the U.S. First, starting with the ideas in transcendentalism with the oversoul they begin. Robert Oppenheimer said, access to Vedas is the greatest privilege this century may claim over all previous centuries. Well, actually, he was living in the mid 20th century and he was wrong because the forebears back in the 1830s been reading it as well. The Vedas are ancient and they are the philosophical part of Hinduism instead of the practical practicing part of Hinduism. Well, what does Emerson have to say about the oversoul? And the essay is available online. Just type in the oversoul, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and you can find copies of it out there. He has this to say: the supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is and to speak from his character and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. Emerson is not an easy writer to read. One of the things that he is striving for in his writing is to get you so worked up and inspired that you're going to, of course, have these ideas on your own, because this is part of the whole romantic transcendentalist thing, is that words themselves in books are not what you're going for. But here he is writing essays that he's going to be printing and also reading around America. So what does he do? He tries to build this system in which you're going to read these words but have your own ideas, and they're going to be very often convoluted, but they're going to be inspiring. So here we are. We too can become part of the oversoul. We are already, but when we realize it, we can reach a point of confidence and power in our own minds. He goes on to say the faith that stands on authority is not faith. I read a little bit from the beginning of nature yesterday that says really the same thing. The faith that stands on authority is not faith. The reliance on authority measures the decline of religion. So if you say, oh, we have to refer back to the Bible, it's the authority. Well, guess what? That indicates decline in the religion. It's the withdrawal of the soul. The position men have given to Jesus now for many centuries of history is a position of authority. This is a direct attack on Christianity, and transcendentalism was seen that way at the time. We not only affirm that we have few great men, but absolutely speaking that we have none, that we have no history, no record of any character or mode of living that entirely contents us. Humanity hasn't lived up to its potential yet, so let's not talk about Socrates and Jesus and all Confucius and those kinds of people. We are the ones who can get out there and get in contact with the oversoul, the oneness of being, and become the great human beings. He goes on to say, the saints and demigods whom history worships, we are constrained to accept with a grain of allowance, all right? Though in our lonely hours we draw a new strength out of their memory, yet pressed on our attention as they are by the thoughtless and customary, they fatigue and invade. All of that old religious tradition is thoughtless, it's customary, and it's fatiguing and invading of the pure soul. The soul gives itself alone original and pure to the lonely, original and pure. Capital letters there, who on that condition gladly inhabits, leads and speaks through it. Then is it glad, young and nimble. It is not wise, but it sees through all things. It is not called religious, but it is innocent. It calls the light its own and feels that the grass grows and the stone falls by a law inferior to and dependent on its nature. Behold, it saith, I am born into the great, the universal mind. So you too, dear people, just get in touch with nature, stop listening to those preachers in those books, and you can be a great human being as part of this universal oversoul and nature. This is absolutely, totally the epitome of what the Transcendentalists were trying to do. And you can see why the established Unitarian Church of the time would find it extremely dangerous. You can also see why it will later lead to all kinds of American movements. After we learn about Hinduism, by golly, then we're going to go off and we're going to learn about Buddhism. And all of these, the foreign religions are going to become very important in American thought. A little more from the Oversoul. More and more the surges of everlasting nature enter into me, and I become public and human in my regards and actions. So come I to live in thoughts and acts with energies which are immortal, thus revering the soul and learning, as the ancients said, that its beauty is immense. Man will come to see that the world is the perennial miracle which the soul worketh, and be less astonished at particular wonders. He will learn that there is no profane history, that all history is sacred, that the universe is represented in an atom in a moment of time. He will weave no longer a spotted life of shreds and patches, but he will live with a divine unity. You can also see how this will later lead in the late 19th century to what we nowadays call New Age thought. It's very much about this the soul becoming more and more part of the universe and more wise and enlightened. Well, that's something to think about. You can look it up online if you want to read more about the Oversoul and what the Transcendentalists were thinking. I want to talk next week a little bit about some of the lesser known but equally important Transcendentalists of the time, because Transcendentalism leads to all kinds of interesting thinking, not only against slavery and against many of the oppressions of the day, but also for women's rights. And Margaret Fuller becomes very important in that movement. So we want to look at some of the other transcendentalists next week. Sunday, come on down. Our sanctuary, as we call it, an upper assembly hall, because we're very transcendentalist about it in that way. We will be open on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Time. If you're in the neighborhood, please come on down and we will celebrate the reopening of First Unitarian Society. And my talk will be called Living Into Our Responsibility. And I bet I will be reading that quote from Theodore Parker. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you on Sunday or next Tuesday. Thanks.